This podcast is brought to you by Ironsight. The logistical complexity of oil and gas field operations can make it difficult to stay on top of who is doing what, where, and when. That's where Ironsight comes in. And so Ironsight connects E&Ps, midstream companies, and service providers so they can collaborate and coordinate with the field services and internal resources more efficiently. Ironsight was designed to support everything from fluid hauling and hot shots to maintenance and trades, making it one of the most versatile field operations and logistics management tools on the market. How do they do it? Well, the secret sauce is, regardless of what type of service, every single job you need done is going to follow the same core workflow. Somebody requests a job, it gets scheduled, the job gets executed, what gets done is documented, and it's reviewed, approved, and the data and the documentation gets sent wherever it needs to go kind of from there. So Ironsight has spent years perfecting their fit-for-purpose function, making their core workflow configurable to any field activity so that you can lower operating costs, reduce your risk, and be more effective across your entire field operation. So whether you work for an E&P, midstream company, or service provider, if you're managing field operations and logistics, you're going to want to take a look at Ironsight. They were also the Energy Tech Night Midland winner a few years back. They've also been on the podcast in the past, good friends of ours. So go check them out. Visit ironsight.app/DW to learn if your company is eligible for a free 3-month trial. It's Ironsight, SIGHT.app/DW. Click the link in the description and let them know that we sent you.
I fired from Cain, now we ain't got no shame. So we started a pod, took Yates to town.
Hey everybody, welcome to Chuck Yates Needs a Job, the podcast. I am cornering the market on the Dans at Pickering Energy Partner. So I got another one. Dan, which Dan are you?
Dan Romito. I'm running point on the consulting business for PEP.
So what is the consulting business because I used to be an investment banker. I know M&A, I know raising financing. I don't know what consulting within an investment bank is.
Yeah, and it varies too, right? There's a lot of buzzwords that people usually throw out from it. Generally speaking, the way that you want to think about it is it complements everything that PEP does, right? We operate on the energy spectrum. So there's companies on the renewable side that are predominantly focused on how do I penetrate the energy markets because we're renewables, we're not as familiar, we're traditionally technologists. And then on the conventional energy side, I think more of the focus is how do we maintain and actually broaden pools of capital? The walls are closing in many cases on access to capital to energy companies. So a lot of the work that we do on the consulting side is partnering with clients on what's the regulatory mandates coming online, what are the expectations of investors, both current and aspirational, and then frankly, what's the competitive landscape look like, all in the pursuit of getting the long-term quality capital that we need to execute our plan.
I got you. Before we jump into that, because there's a lot to unpack there, how do you become a consultant? What did you do with your life before Pickering Energy Partners?
The story is like, how much time do we have, right? It's you kind of fall into it, if I'm being honest. You find this little niche, and then you find out people either don't want to do the niche or they don't have the time to do that particular niche, and then they rely on you to be an extension of their team and do sort of the dirty work that they just don't want to do. Coming out of grad school, I was fortunate enough to land a job with NASDAQ. I was with NASDAQ for almost 9 years. The way that I got that job at NASDAQ was, oddly enough, a guy in my fantasy football league was talking about what he did, and he worked at NASDAQ, and he's like, hey, do you want to work there? So there wasn't any of this nifty networking or skill set necessarily. It was literally, hey, I like how you drafted your team. Let's talk a little bit more about what you do. So when I got to NASDAQ, at that time, it was a scrappy mid cap. It was like 5 or 6 billion market cap. And the new regime, a guy who's I'm actually really good friends with today, his name's Ed Dittmeyer. He was a recently hired IRO. And because I was relatively new and he was relatively new, he was just brainstorming on like, well, how do we get NASDAQ on the map, so to speak? And going through the numbers, it was clear as day, like, hey, why don't you just increase the dividend, the payout? This stuff cash flows like crazy. This business cash flows like crazy. Why don't you increase the payout? And he's like, that's actually pretty hard. That's a lot harder than you think it is to pass. So long story short, we went through this pretty arduous analysis and showcase to the management team and to the board that you should raise the dividend, right? It could have been a 5-minute conversation. It was like a 50-page deck, as most of these things usually lay out. In doing that, I became like the dividend guy. Hey, here's Romito, the dividend guy. And we started basically replicating that analysis to other companies that listed on NASDAQ.
So when was this? What year? What year are we talking?
2015, 2016.
And just because my mom listens to this periodically, so we're talking NASDAQ, the exchange.
The stock exchange.
The stock exchange. Yeah. And so, okay, cool.
Yeah, so I became like the dividend guy. And then that led to other conversations with clients and frankly prospects and getting over the list on NASDAQ or to switch to NASDAQ, like what else could you do? And at that time, that's when the index explosion was taking place, right? Everyone was saying that passive money is overtaking active. It was a little bit foreign. Today, we just take it for granted.
Right.
But at that time, it's like, well, what's going on? In the back of my mind, if I'm being honest, obviously I wanted to grow my career, but I also wanted to weasel my way into going to Europe. Yeah, I was like, how do I get over to Europe? Well, NASDAQ had their second largest exchange was in Stockholm, the Swedish exchange. I'm like, never been to Stockholm. That sounds awesome. Like, let's go. So when we were attempting to cross-sell, the dividend policies and the investor targeting work that we did, when I got to Europe, people were like, well, that's amazing. Do you do anything with ESG? And what? I actually literally never even heard of it. But all the Europeans, whether it was in the Nordics or in continental Europe, they would say something along the lines of, increasingly our investor base is asking about ESG. And it's like,
right.
Like, okay. So did a little bit of homework, did a ton of research, spoke to a lot of the
Went to Wikipedia.
A lot of Google work. They didn't have ChatGPT at the time, so you had to just work with what you had with Google. Brought that back to the States. And then, through analysis and to be fair, like a lot of hard work, got the message out of like, hey, this is probably something that's coming on the horizon. And for like 2 years, people are like, this is dumb. This is never going to happen. It's never going to catch on. And so like after 18 months, my boss at the time was like, are you sure that this is going to pick up? I'm like, oh yeah, totally. In the back of my mind, I'm like, please. I hope so. Like, fingers crossed.
I've got 5 more trips planned to Sweden.
It's like, man, I want to go back to Germany this time. Like, Sweden was fun, but I want to check out some other places. And then, in 2017, when corporates thought that Europe was the next frontier of just investor capital, like for whatever reason, it caught on fire. All the corporates, publicly traded companies, right? Let's get European capital. Let's get European capital. Let's get European capital. What do we have to do? They would make that trip. They would be asked about like, what are your ESG disclosures? What are your policies? And they would come back and we would get these phone calls. You're like, someone would call me and be like, I think your name is Don Romito, I think, and you were talking about GSE. I'm like, my name's Dan Romito. And you're like, ESG? They're like, yeah, totally. So we just began advising clients on frankly what we were hearing anecdotally. We built a variety of cool data sets and technology platforms that would assist them. It became, frankly, a barn burner, caught on like wildfire. And then just from almost just morphed from like the dividend guy to the ESG guy, not because I had any background in ESG, just frankly because our team took the time to actually understand like what it was and how it was helpful and how investors were using it, kind of kept out more of the idealistic. And when Dan Pickering came calling, I had been coincidentally just super entrenched in the energy transition. I very much related it to what we saw with the .com or a lot of the technology advancements that had taken place during the 2000s. And, some of those clients that we're talking about at NASDAQ, you're like, you're not an energy company. You're not a technology company. You're not just a consumer discretionary. You're like this hybrid model. And so when Dan was trying to express to me or explain, like, we think that energy fits on the spectrum, right? And all these companies need our help. Immediately it was like Jerry Maguire. It's like you had me at hello. I thought I was going to work at NASDAQ, frankly, forever. I still have a special place in my heart for those guys. Think the world of Adina Freeman. She helped me a lot in my career. Nelson Griggs, the president of the exchange, was a mentor, but wanted to make that hop.
And so is this, when you're at NASDAQ, is it dollars per assignment? I mean, or was that just that just part of what NASDAQ offered? You list with us, by the way, you get Dan, the fantasy football dude, to come in and talk.
I did great in fantasy football that year too, so like the stars were aligning.
So my fantasy football story is I've been playing with the same guys for 35 years.
Yeah.
We all went to Rice together. And back in the day, I used to win the league every other year. I was great. And then kids came along. And what really hurt me was the advent of the internet, because I used to call like the local beat writer for all the local newspapers. Like one guy turned me on to Doug Flutie starting over Rob Johnson. You know, I had all...
You should have started like a numbers or something like that.
I had all of this insight. And then we also added points per reception. And so I was lamenting 5 years ago to my buddy Fish. I'm like, dang, ever since we made all those changes, I've just sucked. And he goes, well, Chuck, I think priorities have changed in life. If we were playing fantasy blonde country music singer, you'd be kicking our butt.
You'd be the number one contender.
Yeah, maybe so.
Real quick on that too, like I've been playing the same fantasy football league with buddies from high school. Like we've been doing this, I guess now for like, 15, 20 years, whatever it is. And, this is the first year I let my boys help me out in the draft, because I don't have time to follow this. They follow it religiously. They can tell you everything about the team. So my hesitancy was naturally during a fantasy football league, everyone just talks trash the whole time. Sure. So like you give like the heads up. But during the draft, we had to do it remote because some people are in Chicago. We have Florida. They're all over the place. Texas, obviously. My kids, my two boys, they're 11 and 9. Were talking trash about my picks, right? Nice. So they're like, Dad, our team sucks. I can't believe you made this. Like my 9-year-old, he's at the time, he's like crying. He's like, I'm done. And like they walked off.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I ended up doing good. I think I got like 3rd or 4th. But I was like, geez, guys, like never in a million years have like these grown men ever talked as much trash as like you guys are supposed to be on my team. Anyway, the question,
it doesn't get any better.
It doesn't.
My kids are older. It doesn't get any better.
Wait.
So Dan hires you over, and the mission is we're going to go talk to our clients. What's the business model? Somebody pays for an assignment. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean the business model focuses on acting as an extension of the team. I'll be the first one to admit, like I'll give you another funny story. Like I had the opportunity of meeting Mike Pompeo. I spoke at the Petroleum Alliance in Oklahoma, and Pompeo was the keynote. So like I give my little speech on SEC climate disclosure mandate. Pompeo gives up. The guy organizing the event was nice enough to introduce me to Pompeo, and he goes, Mr. Pompeo, this is Dan Romito. He does ESG work for energy companies. And I reach out. This is a true story. I have a picture of it. I reach out to shake his hand. And he goes, like, gives me like the head.
Does he really?
Shakes his head. So like, it's always like nice to like be brought down to earth. But I tell that story because the point is like at the end of the day, people have to focus on executing the business. No one really says, if I'm being honest, like, hey, I love ESG. Like, let's do it. So the flip side of that is in today's market, to raise capital, in 9 out of 10 cases, you have to do it. So the balance is, how do we get the data in the first place? How do we organize it in a manner to where it would pass ideally some sort of assurance or some sort of audit? And then how do we scale this over the course of time so we're not reinventing the wheel?
So let's dig into it, because here was my take. Mm-hmm. So we would go raise money. Ken Hirsch, Natural Gas Partners, in effect creates private equity in energy. Late 90s, he's in there talking to a private capital guy saying, hey, you need me versus biotech versus buyout, whatever. And then he's so successful at it, people allocate 10% to energy, right? Yes. So then you go in and it's like, well, me instead of quantum, instead of in-cap, blah, blah, blah. You do that. Well, at some point, probably about the time you're talking 16, 17, 18, we started hearing what's your ESG policy and the like. And so the way I describe it, I think it was Justice Potter that talked about pornography in the Supreme Court decision. I know it when I see it. Yeah. That's what I kind of felt like LPs were doing. Yeah. And so when we raised Energy Fund 6, we had ESG meetings, and we probably scored a C+, but we were defensive. We didn't have a lot of policies and procedures. Kind of my fallback was, hey, every time I sell an asset, it gets an environmental review, and I've never had a write down. Right. Because of that, So we got through it. So I decided to be more proactive on Fund 7. When we went out raising, at that point, we had our ESG conference. All our CEOs came together. The deal with them is, hey, we're going to go play golf and have fun. We'll have a comedian, but we're 6 hours in a conference room doing real shit. So we would do that. We published an end-of-the-year scorecard and all that. But at the end of the day, we got, y'all have great ESG stuff. But I didn't know what we were doing other than we were just trying to maybe define what it was.
Yeah. I mean, so there's a couple different things, right? I mean, over the last 10 years, the generalist investor, right? I think energy, everyone knows each other. Everyone knows who to turn to within the energy space. It's a very tight-knit group. When it comes to attracting, let's call it generalist capital, it operates on a spectrum. There's some investors that treat this as gospel, like you have to have this, and they're a little bit more idealistic than others. And then on the other end of the spectrum is a check the box. Where we see the utility on it is showcasing differentiators of the business, not necessarily just in an anecdotal sense. So relying less on the qualitative and a lot less on the fluff, and then showing the prowess of the business quantitatively, right? So everyone, what do they usually say? We're unique, we're different. Well, if everyone is saying they're unique and everyone is saying different, by definition, no one's unique and no one's really different. All that stuff begins to look the same. What really sets apart the companies is how are material data points trending? How are your emissions trending? What is your flaring? How is your health and safety record? What is your waste? What is your water? If you can showcase how that is trending, and then marry that with how you're differentiating yourself qualitatively, then nothing is guaranteed, but you're positioning yourself better than what your competitor is.
So what is that? Well, let me say, do you have let's start here. Is there quote unquote an agency, a nonprofit, or somebody that has the magic list that they hand down that you have to go through that certifies ESG?
Yeah.
Or is it you're defining, putting stuff out and you're comparing to peers? What does that look like?
So I think the SEC is trying to do that, right? And now they're, I think their motivations are a little bit, you don't have to go on the political realm, or a little bit slightly different, but maybe indirectly they're trying to create that sandbox, those parameters. Best practices would dictate that the company itself dictates what the narrative actually entails, right? What is the bottom up narrative of this business? And let's control that narrative. One of the things, as an outsider, right, coming from the NASDAQ world, where we did have energy clients, we were just predominantly known more for obviously technology. But what those other sectors did so well, and what energy did not do, frankly, was the successful companies in those respective sectors control the narrative. They did not allow outside factors, outside entities to dictate to the general public what the terms or what the profile of the company was. Now, in fairness, energy is obviously a little bit of a different animal. But, where I think energy got it wrong in 2017, 2018, outside of the shale, like that was a rough time, obviously, was there was like this butting of the heads. Like everybody was doing this, and then energy's like, we're not going to participate in this.
Yeah.
And to be fair, like some did. It wasn't like this flat out refusal. But the flip side of that is today, energy is probably doing a much better job of relative to the other sectors. It's just, that story resonating with the general public, that's a lagging indicator. Like everything about the U.S. energy space, and we've written about this extensively, like that story is incredibly positive, incredibly impressive, whether it's emissions, flaring, health and safety, water stewardship, waste. The prowess of the U.S. energy sector is one to be admired and one to aspire to from a global perspective. And yet when you talk to somebody who thinks about U.S. energy, what do they usually say if they're outside? They say, I saw that movie with Marky Mark, Deepwater Horizon, like
right.
Big Bad Energy, or they saw that movie with Matt Damon and the guy from The Office about fracking, like poisoning my water. And clearly, like energy is no saint, but frankly, the other sectors aren't either. But the whole purpose is to align economic reality with what the data says, and right now those things aren't necessarily reconciled.
So I show up, I'm a client of Pickering Energy Partners. I'm an oil and gas company. I want to go public.
Mm-hmm.
get real granular with me. What are we putting together to?
Yeah. So it starts with the data, right? We take a very data focused approach to all our work. In most cases, the capital markets does have a checklist of everything that they want. It's usually with one of the frameworks that's being, let's call it, modified every 6 months. Like they just can't settle on a framework, which is frustrating in itself. But how a company defines and tracks data, number one, is usually different from how the external world evaluates it or tracks it. And one of the greatest examples is a pretty common framework. It's called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. People usually refer to it as SASB. They measure energy usage in gigajoules. You can go to someone in West Texas, you're like, can I have your gigajoules? And they're like, what are you talking about? Our European friends tend to measure production in cubic meters. I think of everything in barrels. And so it's like, I have to convert that, carry the one, get my Excel spreadsheet going out. But the definitions and the timing of it is just something that usually smaller companies, right, don't have the resources or the patience to do. We handle that. The second thing is the mapping. When you're mapping the data, it has to be in a certain format. Interestingly enough, one of the things that we see is individuals, so people are not, at least initially, evaluating this. We're in a fascinating time where algorithms are leading the charge. Right? You have a lot of algorithms that are programmed to search for very specific disclosures in very specific places. And if you don't disclose it in the right fashion, you're not going to get credit for it. So how do you format your disclosures and where do you place them on your website in order to get credit where credit is due? And then strategically, there is a little bit of a gaming of the system. Everybody's natural inclination is to just push everything that you have to the marketplace. Well, if you push everything that you have to the marketplace, at least initially, you're setting that bar really, really high.
Because when you take it away, people are going to ask why.
Exactly. And the other place thing is to go down. So it's, what do we release to the market? Like how are investor expectations evolving, especially on the public side with BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard? Like that's a whole other conversation. How are LP requirements evolving? What's the regulatory environment? What do we have to do? What should we do? And then what should we aspire to be? Like that sounds easy when you just say it out loud conceptually, but in practice, it's actually.
So what are some of the things we're releasing? What would be in a chart? Methane emissions?
I think, now that the Inflation Reduction Act has the methane tax, and now there's a financial liability in theory associated with methane. Everyone's trying to get a hold of their methane numbers. There's scope 1. So in other words, what energy are you actually using? Scope 1 and 2. There is a school of thought, which I don't agree with at all, on scope 3. Like everyone, you should have scope 3. And it's like, how are we going to do that? Right. And I've yet to see any mathematical correlation established between, let's call it, valuation premium and scope 3 performance. Right?
Well, walk us through scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 on what that is. Real simply.
So the way to think about it is scope 1 is like, what are you responsible for? What are emissions that your business is responsible for? Scope 2 is, what are you taking off the grid? What are you utilizing? And then scope 3 is, what is the environmental or the emissions footprint of your entire supply chain?
So theoretically, an oil and gas company, I'm using gas off the lease to power all my stuff. So theoretically, that's kind of scope 1.
Correct.
Scope 2, I'm connected to the grid, I'm sure somewhere, but
check your utility bills.
Check your utility bills, got that. And then scope 3 is, I'm making a ton of oil and gas and it's burning and whatever it's doing.
And people are utilizing it for a variety of different things. Most of the time, they don't even realize. They don't even realize that it's part of, or it derives from oil and gas if they hate oil and gas, right? The protester that's, tweeting on his cell phone, riding his bike, which is fine, but saying that we should get rid of oil and gas, we're like, none of those tools that you currently have or that you're currently using would be in place. Which is a little bit snarky, but it goes without saying. What's frustrating is we worked with Generac, for example, and when they were debating scope 3, whether or not they're going to do it, it's like, well, how do you track the amount of hours that someone's going to use your generator? Like, are you going to track every single entity and their respective hours when it plugs into when you're using that generator? It's like, no, that's impossible. What even purpose does that serve? So Back to your question, like, what do we do? There is a diminishing utility, like that utility curve falls off a cliff when you just reach a point of like certain disclosures. You just don't need it. It's not going to incrementally improve your profile one way or the other.
Now, you and I are both very rational people, live in the real world. I know people don't believe that. I actually can be rational.
Yeah.
I didn't wear a cuss word on my shirt.
One of the guys, University of Oklahoma, great guy, describes me as operating in the radical middle.
Radical middle.
The radical middle.
You've got room there in the middle. I'll operate with you.
There's a room for
now, you and I both accept that, we can't track every time the Generac kicks off. Is it the market actually seeing that way as well, or are we living in la la land where people still say that Teslas are zero emission, even though 95% of
it's pretty interesting, right? I think it's actually cut up in thirds. Like if we're looking at this on a spectrum, it's thirds. So I think at least initially, like most trends, it just goes 1,000 miles an hour, and then there's an overcorrection. Like for example, Vanguard has pulled out of the Net Zero Investor Alliance. They won't come out and say it, but if you read between the lines in terms of why they did that, their opinion is that there's just a lot of capital that to be wasted in achieving net zero. Now, the pursuit of net zero is something different, which we should talk about. But you see Vanguard pulling out of the Net Zero Investor Alliance. You see Hanover and Munich Re pulling out of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. So there is a little bit of a correction in terms of going gung-ho on net zero. That's 1/3. So just thinking about it pragmatically and saying like, what should we actually do? The other 2/3 are separated into, this is gospel, we absolutely need to do it. And there's a little bit of idealism that's built into the mix. And in my opinion, whatever the energy universe does is they're just going to disagree with it. And then the other third would say something along the lines of go the other way. So almost like staunch detractors of doing anything related to ESG, unless they're, from a regulatory perspective, forced to do. So we have 1/3 of our clients waiting for the SEC climate disclosure mandate to come out. We have 1/3 of our clients that are like, nope, over my dead body. And then we have 1/3 of our clients that are like, okay, let's think about this in terms of, 5-year plan, or like, what do we have to have over the next 5 years so that we remain ahead of the curve.
Got it.
And frankly, all three of them have a pretty good argument as to why they're doing it. So I wouldn't necessarily say any of them are, irrational. I would just say that's, from our observations, how that world is separated. It's by thirds.
So I was talking to Katie Holmes.
Yeah.
And
the actress?
Exactly. The actress. The redheaded actress. You guys, when she came on our Zero conference, we did it was during COVID, so it was one of the streaming events we did. She actually made the point that I hadn't thought of, that Scope 3 in a weird sort of way is going to be really good for oil and gas companies, because at the end of the day, it's going to be Amazon and the vans reporting it. It's going to be, retail stores and the trucking they use to get stuff. And people are going to realize, hey, it's not just oil and gas guys.
Your point is, I agree with all of that. I think it also marks a huge deficiency within the market, and that's the over-reliance on ESG scores, right? I'm probably never going to get a Christmas card from MSCI, for example. But in my presentations, I have this chart, and I give this rhetorical question, like, who has a larger emissions footprint? Is it Amazon or is it Chevron?
Wow.
It's Amazon. And it's frankly not even close. But if you look at the respective ratings, especially with MSCI, Amazon scores off the charts. And you're like, well, if Amazon has empirically a larger environmental footprint, emissions footprint than Chevron, why did they get benefit of the doubt? Well, from a sector perspective, Amazon's sector designation is technically internet retailer, right? I grew up in Illinois. I grew up in northern Chicago. Amazon bought an abandoned airport in Rockford, Illinois, to house their 747s, right? Because it's central United States. And I did a Tough Mudder there right next to it. And you run by this airport, it had to have been like 40, 50 jumbo jets, all Amazon. but they continue to get this credit, as do many other companies, because sector designation in most cases determines the weighting associated with the E, the S, and the G. Internet retailer, about 8% of the weighting goes to the environmental. E and P, like Chevron, about 50% goes. So there's this disconnect in the capital markets, primarily due to the over-reliance of ESG scores, because everything is weighted top down. Like, you're an energy company, therefore your weighting is this. You're an internet retailer, kind of, so your weighting is this. And that's frankly another thing that clients we're working with is improving the scores, because unfortunately it dictates a lot of index and ETF inclusion. A triple B rating with MSCI represents about 20 billion of AUM indexed. And so in a world where passive thematic investing is growing in popularity, it just looks funny if you're saying you have all these things in place, yet you're not included in one of the thematic indices or ETFs that represents that concept.
That's crazy.
It's nuts. It's super frustrating.
That's real crazy. So a client walks in and they're kind of starting from scratch.
Uh-huh.
Walk me through kind of what your advice is, and make up any fact you need to make up. And my audience is mainly energy folks. So let's be an energy company.
Right.
With that, make up some facts. Tell me what you're advising them on. What sort of things you think are best practices? What are the sorts of things you think going to lead to raise money? What?
I think the biggest thing is, what are they looking to achieve? Like, some companies are just like, hey, we just C equals degree. We just want to do enough. Some companies are like, we want to go for the gold. And both are fine, but in most cases it's, we want to pursue these pools of capital, whether it's on the private or the public side. What do we have to do?
I want the highest valuation metric and the most access to capital.
I want the highest valuation. Make sure that cash flow yield is high. Make sure that balance sheet's delevered. Make sure that growth ratio is up. The fourth or fifth thing you should look at is having, your data in order. And I know that sounds so simple, but companies, because of the complexity of energy and because of the various business units, it's a difficult thing to do. It's very time consuming. So it's not hard intellectually. It's hard from a resource allocation standpoint. So we take all that onus off their shoulders. And more importantly, it aligns with how the external world is going to evaluate them. So if an LP is, creating a sustainability report that they're going to use, if a sponsor is going to use a sustainability report to raise money, ensuring that each portfolio company is measuring the right data points in the same fashion, updating at the same time, so that they can aggregate that across a portfolio and then aggregate that up to do benchmarking, however they want to do benchmark, or show trend, however they want to see trend. That's a process that we specialize in.
So what are we measuring? What would be things we'd measure?
The big things, scope 1, scope 2. I mean, all the questionnaires are going to ask for that. Any sort of waste metric. Water stewardship is a huge one. Especially if you look.
What would be a water stewardship metric? I don't even know what that would be.
So water, what's fascinating.
Can I drink it or not? Binary.
Can I bathe in it? Right. Can I cut it with my vodka to make it a little bit less tasty? With water stewardship, 3 years ago, there's like 2 water questions on a questionnaire. It's like, do you have a water policy? What's your freshwater use? Something like that. Today, those questionnaires are actually pretty complex. There's maybe about 8 to 12 questions on water, and it's everything from flow back to recycle to potable. I think, what we see in the San Juan, especially, like, we have a couple clients that operate in the San Juan, where, trucking water not only increases your emissions profile, but it's super expensive. Well, building technology to be a better steward of water use showcases not just necessarily your technological prowess, but also it reduces emissions. It showcases that you're being thoughtful. I think people still don't understand outside the energy space, the people who are evaluating this, with whether it's a stewardship team or just someone reviewing a questionnaire, like, what is flowback? Like, They don't know that terminology. And that goes to my point earlier of, you have to take the time to really educate them because they will probably, in most cases, never admit it. But there's this educational lag that takes place or that exists currently in the capital markets. When you say potable water, they don't know what that means. When you say recycled water, they understand obviously what the notion, the concept of recycled, but they don't understand how that plays in. When you talk about some of the new technologies, whether it's the nitrogen gel or, enhanced ways of fracking, once again, they've been conditioned to think that fracking is the worst F word out there, right? It's a pretty bad F word. How does water play into that? We've had clients come to us where investors outside of energy have asked, well, why is water so important to oil and gas? So this massive lag in terms of understanding not only exists, but I think the questions are becoming more complex because you want to get them to understand, well, how critical is water to the energy space in its entirety, and how are we doing in terms of making that an economic consideration? If you're just going through water, if you're not doing, what your competitors are doing, you can make the argument that it's a margin impact or it impacts margin or cash flow. And I think those evaluations are becoming much more complex. And I always joke that emissions is clearly a 1A, but water is a very close 1B.
Okay. Because, at the end of the day, I mean, again, in the radical middle or whatever we're calling it, we go drill our well to get our fresh water.
Yep.
And we use the water, we frack, and then we take the flow back and we pump it back down to the ground.
Yep.
So on a water scale, I don't think we really did anything. Is that kind of is that me being too much of a homer?
That's too much of a homer.
That's too much of a homer.
That's too much of a homer.
I guess we do have emissions along the way because you're running a rig to drill for that water, and obviously if you have spills, that's kind of bad. But
I think it's part of a broader macro. Like, look what's going on in Arizona with the agricultural space. Like, they're having to stop harvest production, however, I don't know the agricultural term, because of lack of water. You have the dams in Nevada where they're at, I forget the term, but it's like dead man status, right? It's worse than drought. It's called like dead man or something along that. So from a macro perspective, there's a greater emphasis on water because you're either in a position to where you're in this massive drought or where it's impacting, access to water in states for a variety of different reasons. And so those questions sort of fester and then penetrate other areas, and you're like, oh, wait, energy is really reliant on water. Like, what are you doing to ensure that you're not the proverbial that guy? Like,
right.
No one wants to be the that guy with any of this stuff, with emissions or waste or water. So, number one, as I said, it's sometimes a struggle to get the data organized. Of course, in most cases they have it, but it's like, are we that guy?
Right.
Like, are we that company that, unbeknownst to us,
taking it out of a river, taking it out of a lake, you're that guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I definitely get that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always kind of said, well, we drilled for it. I mean, it sits under the ground if we don't take it out. But I guess at some point, it's coming out of an aquifer that maybe somebody else could
someone,
use.
it's another, like, NGOs in particular are getting pretty crafty with how they're connecting the dots and then going or preemptively or proactively calling people out. Now, in some cases, it's totally warranted. And you see this more in the methane world. You see, the EPA, frankly, partnering with NGOs to go search out, like, who are the egregious methane offenders. I don't think it's too crazy or out of the realm of possibility for those respective entities to search for, like, the egregious water offenders, something along those lines. And they do a really good job. They're very well funded. They're very well organized. They have their stuff together. And I think what's more frustrating is they will go out of their way to almost shame somebody. Now, in some cases, there's probably some companies that totally deserve it. But then again, you don't want to be that company. You want to understand, well, where do we stack up on the competitive bell curve? Like, are we in the top quartile? Because if we are, then we're going to have a problem. If we're hovering right around the middle, like radical middle, that's probably the place to be.
Yeah. So what else? Okay. So we're going in, we're getting our data together. We got scope 1, we got scope 2. We're focused on our water use. And we're sitting there thinking through, okay, what are we going to present? Recognizing if we present something and we take it back,
Yeah.
people are going to ask questions.
Right.
And all that. And we're trying to figure out where we want to be. Do we want to be, Captain Kirk boldly going where no man's gone before? Are we going to lag in the back? What else are we thinking through? And then tell me how this is going to be different if we're doing this podcast again in 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. So it's sort of like the art of the disclosure, right? A little bit of who's the audience that we really want this to appeal to? And then how is the data trending? And then people tend to think, if we highlight this vulnerability, like we're releasing Pandora's box. In most cases, odds are that whoever they is, the external party, they're already aware of that, right? They're doing this work. So it's almost like this preemptive scouting report. We're scouting external evaluators so that you can get ahead of anyone backing you into a corner and saying, like, why are you doing this? The art of the disclosure, as we like to say, is, okay, we don't want to do too little and we don't want to do too much. What's the competitive landscape look like? Are you fulfilling the regulatory obligations, namely SEC climate disclosure mandate, sustainable finance disclosure regulation out of Europe? I'll get to CSRD because that's the next framework to kind of enter the framework wars. And then saying, okay, how would this data be, what's the context for this, how this data would be evaluated? I think you have to marry a narrative, a realistic and obviously a realistic and an honest narrative associated with that, but the talking points. So I'll give you an example. We have a client whose flaring is really, really high. Their flaring is ridiculously high. But it's ridiculously high because they're being compared to operators in the Permian and the Eagle Ford. This company operates in the Bakken. So if I'm looking at this, if I'm an external party, I'm like, wow, this company's flaring is ridiculously high. Why is that? The reasonable, logical answer is, well, they're in the Bakken. We were talking to a stewardship team with a very influential institutional manager. And they're like, well, why is this so high? It's like, well, you have to understand, like, you're comparing Bakken to Permian. Probably shouldn't do that. It's apples and oranges. I swear to God.
And just to flesh it out for mom, there's
North Dakota, West Texas.
Yeah, North Dakota, West Texas, and there's just not a lot of associated natural gas with Bakken producing. So it's really expensive to put in a pipeline, capture that natural gas. In West Texas, you can put pipe out on the ground.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of natural gas around. So there's pipes everywhere. It's a lot easier to gather. And in North Dakota, because so little gas, you're sitting there. It's so much easier to just flare it.
Right. And so the question was, well, what's the Bakken? And you're like, okay. So it showcases the point of someone was very well intentioned and someone had taken the time externally to do the work, but there are talking points that they need to be educated on. So it's not necessarily let's benchmark you. It's let's evaluate you as you would be evaluated. Let's give you that preemptive scouting report, the talking points, and prepare you for that inevitable question. And then it's based upon where you reside in the competitive bell curve. Who are the other investors that you're not necessarily thinking about that you should? We've had several clients where they're pleasantly surprised. It's like, hey, actually on these metrics, you're in the top quartile. You're top 20th percent. And you're like, really?
So what is the story you use in the Bakken? I mean, do you go in with a chart saying we're in the top quartile of Bakken producers? Well, frame it that way. You change geography, or and again, if I'm asking for state secrets, don't give me that because I'm not cutting Pickering Energy Partners a check, so it's not that fascinating.
Actually, someone I work with, Rachel, actually, she's like, "Well, are you going to wear the PEP vest?" I'm like, "I don't want to. You're not going to do overkill here. Like, I don't want to be like a walking billboard during the podcast." No, I mean, most of it's just logical. It's, luckily for that particular client, when it was just relegated to Bakken related benchmarking, middle of the pack.
Yeah. Right.
We haven't had, luckily, someone where they're like that egregious. I think there's other issues that come from it. The interesting thing too is the EPA now releases like these egregious offenders on the methane leaks. And we've hey guys, we saw this, and they're like, yeah, we kind of felt like we'd be on the list, but this is news to us, right? So a lot of it is like you don't know until you know. And I think one of the value adds that we're bringing to the table is let's not necessarily just evaluate you as an energy focused person would, because let's be honest, most of them don't understand how they think. It's how would the generalist community evaluate you? Because those are the ones making the determinations on this. And let's look at it through the world, through their eyes, and see, what they would potentially come back to you and flag, and let's prepare you for that. Right? So energy goes back to the broader issue of energy is traditionally, at least over the last 10 years, been backed into a corner and been forced to explain why they do or don't do something. And now we want to flip that table around, or as Michael Scott says, the turntables.
Right.
We want to turntables, and we want to put them in a position where they're proactively and frankly preemptively identifying where they're strong, but also where they're weak and what they're doing about the perceived vulnerabilities. I think the days of energy being in a position where they are just backed into this corner, it's not going to get anything done.
Yeah, no, I mean, burying your head in the sand.
Right.
Guess what happens in a vacuum? The other side wins. Mm-hmm. They get all the airtime. So yeah, no, I agree with that. So, okay. So looking out 3 to 5 years, some trends that are going to change, some things that energy companies could do to be proactive, to maybe look, we're never going to get the narrative back where people are patting us.
You don't think so? You don't think energy will ever get the narrative back?
No, because the second we come close, we're going to do something really stupid, like start printing up, freeze a Yankee bumper stickers, exactly. And do that stuff that we have a tendency to do. But I mean, I told this to a very prominent private equity energy guy the other day. I said, if the world knew you existed, the environmentalists would have a lot less.
That's true.
Sway over the world, because this guy's a great guy. He spent all his money on all these charitable endeavors and all. And I'm like, come on the podcast and talk about it. Oh, I don't want to do that. And I'm like, seriously, you kind of only have yourself to blame. But so what can we be doing?
So I think on the trends,
let's play offense now.
A little bit of offense. So I think respectfully, I think the mentality of waiting for the SEC climate disclosure mandate to be released officially is the wrong strategy to take. And the reason I feel like that is even the most stringent detractors and people who hate that rule the most, if you read the opinion that Hester Peirce, she's the former SEC commissioner, she just lambasts it. She's like, this is the worst idea ever. She is publicly like, this is going to pass, right? I did an event with her at the Petroleum Alliance of Oklahoma, and she spent, 30 minutes, very well thought out, incredibly thoughtful rebuttal. And then the last 5 minutes were like, well, you better prepare for this because it's coming. Right? Like spending 40 minutes is terrible. I hate it, blah, blah, blah. Last 5 minutes.
Other than that, Ms. Lincoln, how was the play?
Yeah, exactly. So getting out ahead of the climate disclosure mandate means a couple different things. There's a framework called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, it's commonly referred to. And that is separated into 4 distinct sections. And the first 3 are predominantly qualitative. It's a little bit fluffy. Where clients struggle the most is that 4th aspect is metrics and targets. So not only do you have to have the quantitative metrics in place, and as the rule is written today, assurance, both limited and reasonable, comes online in 2026, you have to provide some sort of target. So from a regulatory perspective, you have to provide a target, which once again, I don't agree with, but we're realists. And if the SEC says, do this, you kind of have to do it. If you don't have trending data that has consistent definitions, so in other words, you haven't measured it the same or tracked it the same over the last 3 years, it's really, really hard to get a target in place that makes sense. And with the targets, you don't want to go for the gold, but you don't want to under promise. That's a function of like, what does the competitive landscape look like and where do we fit in with that? So that's the first one, TCFD with the SEC climate disclosure mandate. The other one is a framework brewing out of Europe. So unfortunately, how this usually works is something, an idea is born in the Nordics, it bleeds into continental Europe, makes its way to Canada, and then some semblance of it trickles into the United States. That is referred to as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Most of people just abbreviate these things. It's CSRD. CSRD is the attempt to aggregate, or I should say, aggregate all the existing frameworks in place. So I won't go through all of them, but from a regulatory perspective, that is sort of the sandbox that the EU wants to have. It's arduous. It's really time consuming. We've done it for a couple clients, a little bit more higher on the sophistication curve because they're larger market cap and, their European investors are asking for it. Preparing for that, I mean, I'm not going to lie, man, thing sucks.
Yeah.
It's not fun. The third one is SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And what's fascinating about that legislation is it's obviously EU, but it impacts equity, debt, insurance, because that attempts to separate the capital markets into three categories. It's Article 6, Article 8, Article 9. I didn't forget about Article 7. I actually don't know what Article 7 is. Article 6 is the investment universe in its entirety. Article 8 is some aspect of your business has an E or an S attribute. And then Article 9 would be, they call it impact, we call it renewables funds. Now, the EU is going to mandate that if an asset manager wants to have an ESG fund, or if they're going to claim they have any focused on ESG, which in today's market, my opinion is you can't really raise capital without having that, you have to provide quantitative evidence that validates that claim. So if an asset manager is going to be on the hook to prove why they are an Article 8, for example, fund, well, obviously they're going to go to their portfolio companies and say, well, we need these data points. It's a compliance issue. What's interesting is this has been around for like roughly a year or so. The initial data showcases that about 2/3 of all global equity flows is Article 8. So people want to play both sides of the fence, right? They want the conventional portfolio management, but they want a sprinkle of ESG because either they can charge more fees, like that's another thing that's interesting. But the onus is on the portfolio manager to get the data. If the onus is on the portfolio manager to get the data, then obviously portcos, private and public, and that impacts the insurance world as well. We've actually partnered with an insurance company. They called us, frankly, out of the blue. They're like, yeah, Munich Re is asking us, for all these data points, and we don't know what the hell they mean. Right. Can you help us? We're like, yeah, of course. Like, come on down. I think too, people are like, well, Article 8, if all the capital flows. Well, keep in mind too, like from a Morningstar actually tracks this. There's a little bit of mean reversion going on with management fees, but on average, over the last 3 years, an ESG fund can charge about a 25 to a 30% premium on management fees. So there is, as cynical as it sounds, an economic incentive for fund managers to incorporate ESG because for the time being, at least, I think over the foreseeable future, it justifies higher fees. Now, what's frustrating is like performance-wise, ESG funds and conventional funds actually pretty much perform the same, and there is a little bit of mean reversion, as I said, going on with fees, but those fees have remained consistently higher than conventional funds for like the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, fees can be sticky.
Yeah.
What I've always told folks is you sit there and my girlfriend's British, so I got to be really careful here.
From improper? How many times have you made the tea and strumpets joke?
None.
Oh, okay. Good for you, man. I don't know if I can hold out.
Yeah, no. But one of the things she's done is she's chastised us because on the other podcast I do, BDE, we talk about Europe.
Yep.
And she's like, come on, it's 20, 30 different countries. So over the last kind of 2.5, 3 months, we've done a blurb on each European country and their energy policy.
Yeah.
And they are different. I mean, France and their nuclear power is the battery for Europe, which allows other countries to get away with stuff. Then you've got this whole issue of each one of these European powers and their colony and where they were colonizing, they get energy from. So there's this whole thing. But where I was going with this is one of the things that's become very apparent to me is if something starts in Europe, we can turn our nose up at it. But guess what? They've got all the insurance companies.
Yeah.
They have all the ships.
Yeah.
The Greeks have a third of the ships out there.
Well, the other thing, people don't realize is the cross-pollination between the institutional investor community, right? You have Pioneer Mundi or Schroders Aberdeen, like a lot after MiFID II, which for the nerds out there, MiFID II was like the restriction on research, turn it upside down. You just had a lot of mergers between U.S. Institutions and European investors. And from a compliance standpoint, it's always been the case where if we have a cent, wherever we have a cent in the most strict of compliance, we're going to abide by the most strict of compliance. So yes, it's European legislation, but it impacts America, granted indirectly, but it's much more of an issue of, like I said, I keep using the word compliance. But if I'm a U.S. investor and I want exposure, even $1 worth to Europe, I have to abide by their regulations. I don't have a choice.
Well, and something I didn't appreciate until we started doing the deep dive is 20% of the S&P 500 earnings come out of Europe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Yankee arrogance. I always thought it was 99% us, 1% the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean,
You
so
know.
when I was in Europe, I mean, one of the things that they think about is the big difference, just philosophically, as it relates to investing, is Europeans tend to look at the world from 10 years out. Like that is their investment horizon. Institutional investors, now there's exceptions, of course, but what do we usually think? Quarter.
Right.
You know, when the running joke is once you finish quarterly earnings, the next day you have to prepare for quarterly earnings.
Right.
And so with the vast majority of, money in Europe being either endowment or pensions, they're focused on like, what is the 10-year? What do we look like in 10 years? Now, to be fair, I think US companies do that as well, but they just don't weigh it as heavy. And you see that in the numbers. Like, what do you think the average tenure of a publicly traded CEO is?
No idea.
It's 4 years.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's 4 years. Like,
Oh, wow.
on average, they're on board for like 4 years. And so just by definition, I think the mentality is like, hey, I'm either going to burn out or do something else within half a decade. Europe is looking at it like, hey, what does 2040 actually look like? And so,
you know what? Something that overlays this too, that I've come to appreciate from her is, I mean, in England, they have meters in the house, so you can watch how much you're spending right at that moment. And they are willing to conserve. They're willing to put a sweater on. None of us are.
Yeah.
I mean, we are so much more about consumption. And over in Europe, they will be about conservation, et cetera. And so I think that plays into it.
Yeah,
as well.
definitely. I agree with that. I would also say, look, if I live in Florida, like my family lives in Florida. Obviously, I work in Houston, so I go between. Originally, I'm from Chicago. And so when we first moved here 3 years ago, if I would have told my wife, like, hey, can we go easy on the AC? It's like divorce. Like,
Yeah.
Get out of the house.
Exactly.
Like, you want to go, you want to turn that thermostat maybe to 74? Like,
Yeah.
She's like, no, absolutely not. So I think, there's definitely something to, let's not change the way that we live or change the standard of living. But if you look at the numbers, and I have these here, like if you're looking at emissions per dollar of GDP, the US is the most efficient. Like we've cracked that rubric. We've cracked that code. We've figured out how to decouple. So in other words, GDP has gone up substantially, 2.7% per year, with the exception of COVID, of course, since 2000. But we've done it with, utilizing 40% less energy. So we figured out how to increase GDP and use less energy to do so. We're one of very few countries on the planet that's done that, right? Our emissions profile follows a linear model. China, for example, is exponential.
Right.
So I don't think the United States, in terms of energy policy, gets credit. Like there's this, in my opinion, this blanket overarching notion or argument that all of energy is bad and you just need to get rid of oil and gas. And you're like, are you out of your mind? Like you can't do that. What the argument should be is, okay, if the world's energy mix is 85% oil, gas, coal, how long is it going to take to go from 85% to, let's call it 50%? It's going to take a really, really long time. We're talking about decades, not talking about years. And then more importantly, if you look at where oil, gas, and coal make up almost 100% or the vast majority of fossil fuel-based energy consumption, you're talking about China and India. I want to meet the guy that can convince India to not utilize oil, gas, and coal to increase the standard of living. Like, whoever that guy is,
Right.
he's my guy. He should be president here.
Yeah.
Like that, because that's an amazing salesman. The reality is they're not going to do that. So I want to sound patriotic and I want to sound reasonable, but the fact of the matter is, like, empirically, the United States has figured this out. Like, that is a model that the rest of the world, if they're really focused on decarbonization, that they should adopt, because we figured it out. Now, to your point on France, like, yeah, this conversation's done if we just go nuclear.
Right.
But for whatever reason, like, there's like, it's the barbell. It's like, I'm going to play with my toys over here. Everyone else is dumb or stupid and doesn't want to listen. And on the other side, it's, I'm going to play with my toys over here, and everyone who doesn't agree is dumb or stupid or doesn't care.
So we'll follow up at some point, because what I'd love to do is have all of Pickering Energy Partners here, because I would like to pose this, because this is where kind of over the last 2 years podcasting, thinking about it, knowing what I know about energy, I think what you just said, China and India are going to do what they're going to
Do whatever they want to do.
Given that the money we are spending today, we can spend trillions to go to electric vehicles, and you can make a case they're arguably a push when it comes to emissions. Or let's say they're better, but are they better enough to overcome India and China? I don't think the technology exists today that can counter China and India. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't be better and we shouldn't do these good things. I'm thinking we have limited dollars.
Yeah.
And we ought to look, what should we be doing with them? And my vote would be, I'd be funding more radical next generation type technology research versus having a recycling program that loses the city of Richmond $100,000 a year.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's go throw that $100,000 a year at some kid at MIT.
But that's already being done, right? So another, I know when we were talking earlier, you're like, the best way to lose someone is just throwing out facts, figures. So hopefully I don't lose you. If you look at climate tech VC funding last year, it's like about $40 billion or so, something like that, in that neighborhood. A fifth of that came from big oil. And so once again, I don't want to sound like an apologist for big oil, but if I went to any joker on the street and said, where does a fifth of climate tech funding come from? I guarantee you big oil would be at the bottom of the list. Probably wouldn't even be mentioned.
Right.
If you look at energy patents, or green patents, like any sort of green patent associated technology, the industry is leading the way. And this was a study done by Harvard, who divested from fossil fuels.
Right.
25% of green patents in 2020 came from energy and power companies. So that's, relating it back to like what we do. I think philosophically, there's this disconnect between what the energy sector actually does and on how people perceive them, right? What economic reality is and what common perception is, or, those are two separate islands. Those are two separate planets. They're not even close to being reconciled. And then when we have this debate, you'll love this story. I've given it to a lot of our clients. It's almost like overplay now, but I was giving a talk at one of the CFA societies, and it was a debate, very cordial, but it was with portfolio managers, mostly generalists. So very smart, very accomplished, very intelligent, and everyone was super cool. So it wasn't like I was going into like the lion's den armed with pitchforks or something like that. And one of the comments from one of the audience members is like, well, what would it take to electrify everything? Like, why can't we just electrify everything? And I said, well, outside of us not having enough copper globally, like, let's pretend that we did. If you did electrify everything, by definition, the way things stand today, you would increase your reliance on coal, which would be, a little bit counterproductive. And you would have thought, like I said, something obnoxious or crazy. She's like, no, that's not true. Like, well, where do you think, electricity gets its power from? And I swear to God, and I had the next slide ready, right? I knew where this was going. Like, I've done this rodeo before. And I swear to God, very established, very smart, very accomplished portfolio manager. She goes, I go, where does electricity get its power from? She goes, electricity.
Yeah.
And the next slide is like, well, actually 40% comes from coal.
So I used to take all my portfolio company CEOs out to play golf in California. And we were playing at this golf tournament, and Tesla was sponsoring it. And this was 10 years ago.
Right.
So how should I describe this? Very easy on the eyes, 24-year-old, telling us all about the Tesla, talking about zero emissions. And one of my CEOs, an engineer, is like, well, where does the electricity come from? She goes, well, you just plug it into the wall.
There's a fascinating, I mean, look it up on YouTube. It's in Michigan. Yeah. There's the Chevy Volt.
This is so great. What are we doing today? 90% coal.
Right. So where does the power come from? The power comes from the building. Yeah. Like, well, what powers the building? And she's like, coal? Yeah. And then like the director of the utilities, it like goes to him. He's like, our grid is on 90%.
Coal. Yeah.
Good Lord. But that is the argument. Like one of the funniest things I've ever seen, like there's a meme and it's a Tesla and his license plate is coal lover.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
It's great. But I mean, that goes to the point of the disconnect that exists. Like I would make the argument with anybody that, even, and you alluded to it, is Teslas aren't net zero.
Yeah.
Like what do you need? You need lithium, cobalt, aluminum, copper. Like, have you seen a strip mine?
Yeah. Like mine's run on diesel.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
that's why I honestly think if we went 100% electric cars in the United States, I actually think oil usage would go up because the diesel needed to actually mine all of those minerals. And I mean, we couldn't really do math on that. We could stab at it, but I mean, at the end of it,
to begin with is just funky back of the napkin math anyway. Like it's just littered with assumptions, and you're like, okay, well, what is what? And then when you actually go through it, it's like, okay. And once again, I didn't come up through the energy space. Like I came up through like the NASDAQ world. So you would evaluate this all the time and say something along the lines of like, just doesn't make sense. Like, okay, you need a ton of copper. Do we even have that? Right. And, one of our PMs, you should actually have him on. He's awesome. Mackenzie Davis. Is a PM for Sailing Stone. When it comes to like metals and mining, and I have a question, I'm like, Mackenzie, what's up? Yeah. And he's a fascinating guy too. Like he's sailed like from Maine to Portugal with his daughter, and he's like this big. Oh, wow. Anyway, he'd be an interesting guy, but he does this fascinating presentation, and I'm going to butcher the numbers a little bit. I'm going to be off by a couple years. Sure. And it's something along the lines of, when was the last time the globe successfully brought a copper mine online? When was the last time?
I have no idea.
It's like 96. It's like 1996, 1997. So like before I was even in high school, right? I was like in 7th grade or something like that. And then how long did it take to extract the first remnants of copper from that mine?
I'm going to say 2010, but I have no
20 years, right? Now, once again, I'm off by, I'm coming from memory. I'm off by 2 or 3 years. I'm not off by 5. I'm off by 2 or 3 years. And then how much did it cost?
Billions.
$20 billion.
Yeah.
So you go through this and people are like, yeah, just get some copper. Like I'm going to go down to Ace Hardware. Yeah. Get my copper. I'm going to stick it in the back of my pickup truck. Right. Here you go. Here's some copper. It doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. And your point earlier on like capital is finite. Like the great irony that's going on in this place, and DRP says it perfectly, is, there's some degree of self-inflicted wounds that the energy space has because of the shale days. And the result of that was all you people are going to be capital disciplined to the nth degree moving forward. Like it's about cash flow, deleveraging, buybacks, dividends. That's it. On the flip side, the investors are also saying, my God, like this renewable technology is amazing. And like, here's some money, like go do it. Well, it's like, which one do you want? Do you want the capital discipline approach, or do you want sort of like the home run speculative bet? Because those two things are completely different. And for the time being, renewables in many cases are that speculative bet. Now, I always tell people this, like my personal money is, I have my largest exposure, my largest investment is an electrification company, right? So my kids' college, like they're either going to JUCO or they're going to Ivy League, depending on how this electrification investment goes. So I believe in it. But I also believe in capital discipline and operating under the mindset that, yes, capital is finite, capital is increasingly more expensive, and then we should pursue net zero, right? We should pursue it because along the way, we're probably going to come up with some really cool, innovative technology or capability, whatever that is. But we shouldn't draw this line in the sand and be like, it's all or nothing, like it's net zero or bust. I think that's just going to result in a variety of bad decisions, bad capital allocation, and it's not going to result in the technologies that we want.
Yeah, I had my environmentalist friend Kelly Mitchell on the podcast. One of the things she said that I don't think I appreciated, because I was like, Why can't we just be a little better each day? Because we're a little better each day. And there's a famous Pat Riley story about when the Rockets beat the Lakers in the first round of the playoffs. Everybody was saying, break up the Lakers and all that. Pat Riley wrote each player a letter that offseason that went through, this was your personal best season. You had this stat.
Okay.
He goes, if you can do 1% better this year, and he totaled it up. He said, this is what the team would look like. You know, blah, blah, blah. And he wrote that individual letter. Everybody did 1% better. And look at that. The Lakers won the championship again. And I always said that we should just be incremental. The issue Kelly has is, but if we don't draw a line in the sand somewhere, we get hooked into something and get more dependent on it. And so,
well, I would push back. I mean, so the pushback I would have on that is the market, right? University of Chicago guy, Bill Friedman, you know,
right.
I'll argue him all day. The market has already said decarbonize. There is a fixation that I don't think that, there's a fixation that is permanent, which says every company on the globe has to figure out how to decarbonize. Now, do you need a line in the sand? I think it goes back to yours, like show your trend, right? You just can't say we're going to go to net zero and then say, well, you know, forget ROI and then forget financial performance. Like those things are in many cases mutually exclusive. Those are different goals. You can allocate capital in a responsible manner that earns a return that results in better technology to get you closer to net zero. I think that's a more pragmatic route to take, because if you blow all your money and do not earn that investor return, that idealism is going to go right out the door pretty quick. It's like,
we're starting to see that.
Right.
The new CEO of Shell has come out and said that. Do you see what what's the CEO of Exxon, Darren Woods, said the other day?
I did.
We're a molecule company, not an electron
I mean, Darren's got the best quotes, right? What do you call it? ESG lipstick on a pig, right?
Yeah.
I think he's got these one-liners. But yeah, I think back to the question of, you know, there's some environmental groups that we talk to, and, you know, no names but the question is like, why is ROI so important? And it's like, no, these are smart people.
Yeah.
But they've come up different ways, right? Different perspectives. And it's, I think it goes into the mentality of, God, they just want to destroy our business and they don't care. Now, there obviously is some of that, you know, it would be naive to say, but there's also a perspective and a line of thinking that isn't accounted for. Like when I get the question, actually more times now that I'm thinking about it, I get it, you know, often enough, like, why is ROI so important? It's like, well, here, give me $10.
Yeah.
Okay, here's 8. Like, now if you gave me $10 and I gave you 15 back,
right,
you're more inclined to give me another $10, $10. If you give me $10 and I give you 8, and you give me $10 and I give you 8 back, like, you'd be like, sooner or later, like, I don't know if I'm really going to give you that money. And I think back to the short-sighted issue that I bring up in the United States, you know, there's going to be a point in time where investors are like, this, like, we would love to do it, but we just can't afford to do this anymore. Like, we need a return. And where I get really, I guess, where I really get cautious is like pension funds and endowments, particularly pension funds that are probably not in the best fiscal state, saying we're going to pull out of energy and gas. Well, in this macro, where are you going to earn return, right? The well-being and the standard of living, as idealistic as it sounds, is contingent upon your performance. And if you're pulling out of oil and gas to win, you know, social points, you know, you're putting a lot of people at risk because of how you feel about it. That is meeting a fiduciary responsibility and fulfilling some sort of personal, you know, obligation or whatever you want to call it. Those things should not be commingled.
Yeah, the way I always look at it is, if the colleges want to go do that, knock yourself out. Y'all are colleges, but when the firefighters and the policemen and folks like that that are going to need that money to retire on and live in decide they want to do that, that's where
that's
really
a problem.
Where it gets.
And I would say, like, you know, I teach, I'm on staff at Marquette in Milwaukee, and, you know, Marquette decided to divest from fossil fuels, and they had a conference there, and respectfully, I laid into the guy of like, and he ended up saying, well, it wasn't my decision. It's like, okay. But my response was, okay, Milwaukee is like Chicago. It gets sub-zero, quite often in the winter. Turn the heat off.
Yeah.
You're going to love oil and gas.
Turn off your iPhones right now.
Well, turn the heat off in the winter. Like if you're that committed to detract or from divesting from oil and gas, like, let's be honest, like turn off the heat and let's see what happens. You're going to ask for it real quick. And but you talk to some of the younger people, like my wife, so this is a funny story. My son he just turned 11. So he's in 5th grade. And he came home from school today. He's like, Dad, you'd be so proud of me. Like, and usually it's like, Dad, kind of candy, like, Dad, whatever. I'm like, so he like blows me off, like any 11-year-old would do. But he comes home and he's like, I gotta tell you. He's like, we were talking about energy in school today, and my teacher said we need to go renewable. And I raised my hand. I was like, no, we need oil and gas. And so ordinarily, my kids, like most kids, right, turn into complete psychopaths the second they sniff sugar.
Right.
Like in the room.
Yeah.
So like we have like this very strict, like only on special occasions, and like even that it's in moderation. I'm like, get your ass in the car, go into the ice cream shop. You get like eight layers, chocolate, so everything, man. And he's like, really? I'm like, hell yeah. Like, get in that car now. He's like, why? He's like, I'm so proud of you. Like, you stood up to the man, and like, it was funny because like, there's oftentimes I'm working at home and he'll overhear it, and he's got like this curiosity that brute. He's like, well, tell me about this and tell me about that. I'm like, okay. He's like, well, why? He's like, I have a couple friends, and they're like, yeah, oil and gas, and like it kills things. I'm like, here's what you tell them. Like, here's the talk. So I'm giving like this 11-year-old, like real, like, academic, empirical data points, which my wife's like, what are you doing? I'm like, no, he has to learn this. But young kids, and I'm sensitive to this because my kids, have a 5, 9, and 11-year-old. There's enough talk where they're like questioning, do we need oil and gas? I'm like, guys, like, come on, like, we should always embrace technology, and we should always strive to create innovative technologies. And if we land upon some sort of innovative, functional technology that replaces oil and gas, that's awesome, and we should do that. But to just say get rid of it, without any sort of backup plan in place, don't tell kids that. Like, and so once again, I was super proud.
Yates kids.
Yeah.
Because my kids don't believe that. They get rid of oil and gas and say, Yates kids, I'm going to play this for you multiple times, because that fancy car you're driving right now, fancy house you live in, the great education you got was all paid for by oil and gas.
But that's why I also equally get as frustrated on the corporate side, because it's like, you guys have a great story to tell. And I understand the hesitancy, and I understand and appreciate why in some cases you don't want to do it. Aside from the regulatory or the impending regulatory landscape that's about to unveil itself, and aside from the expectations of the investors, like, this is a positive story. Like, there's some blemishes, like with any story, like with any sector, but the trends, the capabilities, the technologies, like I have a hard time digesting why there's such this apprehension to let's say play the game. Play the game. Like, if you're approaching it like a chess match as opposed to checkers, like, this is going to look so much better in 5, 6, 7 years than what people think it's going to be.
Well, and at the end of the day, if we don't say it, if we don't tell our stories, the other side gets to define us, and we get what we deserve. So, all right, Dan, is there another Dan over at Pickering Energy Partners?
There's Mr. Pickering, of course, yes.
But there's got to be another one. So I've had Pickering on, I've had you on.
Yeah.
Is there another Dan?
We have a lot of Chris's.
Maybe I'll start my string of Chris's on.
I think we've exhausted the Dan train. Yeah, you got to work on the Chris's now.
There we go. Well, dude, thanks for coming on.
Man, I appreciate it.
This was really cool.
For sure. Thank you.